Cut the janitorial division. Start tonight. The man snapped into his phone as steam poured from the hood, and the woman standing beside him froze, drenched, shaking, realizing he was talking about her. Traffic roared past, the Texas heat closed in, and he never noticed her face until she took one step closer. What happens next is the moment that changed everything. The black Cadillac Escalade skidded to a stop less than 50 yards ahead. Steam hissed from the hood. Traffic kept moving. Houston didn't notice. Olivia stood frozen at the bus stop, plastic grocery bag dangling from one hand, the other clenched so tight her knuckles burned. The August heat pressed down on her shoulders, mixing with the grime on her clothes, the humiliation settling deeper than the stain. Inside the Escalade, Christopher Baker slammed his palm against the steering wheel. No, don't hang up. He snapped into his phone, sweat darkening the collar of his dress shirt. The signal crackled. The screen flickered. His ride to Marlin Mansion, Washington, D.C., had died on a Texas street with no warning. Earlier that afternoon, before the heat, before the splash, before the phone call that would change everything, Olivia Noah had already been on her feet for 10 straight hours. If you're ready to hear the whole story, click the subscribe button and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. We want to know how far our story travels. Now, let's get into it. The kind of hours that leave a low ache behind the eyes. The kind that makes time feel sticky. Olivia moved through the last office floor with practiced care. Empty trash cans, wiped desks, lights humming over silence. When she clocked out, the sun was still high, pressing down on Houston like a hand that wouldn't lift. By the time she reached the bus stop on Westheimer, sweat had soaked the collar of her uniform, and the day felt unfinished. Across the street, the Escalade idled, then stuttered. Inside, Christopher Baker, 40, billionaire by every public measure, stared at a phone that refused to cooperate. Bars dropped to nothing. The air conditioning gave up with a tired sigh. He loosened his tie, frustration sharpening his breath. Texas wasn't supposed to interrupt him. His real life waited thousands of miles away. Marlin Mansion, Washington, D.C., where decisions landed clean and consequences stayed abstract. Here, stranded, the rules felt different. When the hood went up, heat poured out like a warning. Olivia watched him pace, watched the way urgency made his steps shorter. She could have turned her face away. Instead, she crossed the curb and offered what she had, cold water from her bag, a spot of shade beneath the raised hood, her phone's hotspot without a word about the splash. He accepted with a nod that meant thanks, and something else he didn't have time to name. The call finally connected. Budgets are tight, Christopher said, voice clipped. If we have to trim, start with the janitorial division. Olivia didn't flinch. She listened. Numbers floated between them, percentages, projections, clean words for messy lives. She thought about the offices she'd cleaned that morning, the fingerprints she erased without ever being known. She thought about how people like her disappear unless someone chooses to see them. If you've ever felt that quiet erasure, stay here a moment. Stories only matter when they're witnessed. The tow truck was delayed. Minutes stretched. The heat didn't care. Long day, Christopher asked finally. Long years, Olivia said, not unkind. He looked at her then, really looked, and the conversation began, cautious and human, with the sun still high and the engine ticking as if it were counting time. The heat settled into a steady hum, the kind that made conversations slow down whether people wanted them to or not. Olivia leaned against the curb, eyes on the open hood, and spoke like she was explaining something simple, because to her it was. People call it low skill, she said, but it's caretaking. You're looking after spaces folks think run on their own. Christopher listened, arms folded, sweat darkening his cuffs. The words didn't sound rehearsed. They sounded lived in. Olivia talked about nights when the offices were empty and the city felt far away. Polishing conference tables no one would sit at until morning, resetting chairs, turning off lights so buildings could rest. She remembered the way downtown looked after midnight, glass towers reflecting her own tired face back at her. Someone has to notice what everyone else ignores, she added. Spills, broken locks, the small stuff that turns into big problems if you leave it. Christopher shifted. He never thought about offices sleeping. He'd never wondered who tucked them in. He asked questions then, soft ones. How long she'd done the work. What she liked about it. Whether it ever felt thankless. The edge in his voice was gone, replaced by something uncertain. He wasn't leading a call or cutting a budget. He was just a man waiting for help on a Texas street. Olivia answered without giving too much away. She never offered her last name. She didn't talk about bills or pride, or how often she was tired. She spoke about doing a job well, about leaving a place better than you found it. The tow truck's rumble broke the spell, orange lights flashing against the Escalade's black paint. The driver hopped out, clipboard in hand, all business. Relief crossed Christopher's face, followed by an urge to say something that would sound like gratitude, but risk turning into pity. Olivia stepped back before he could find the words. "Take care," she said, already moving toward the bus stop. "Hydrate. This heat doesn't play fair." He watched her walk away, her uniform still marked, her stride steady. He realized he hadn't asked for her name, and that the absence felt heavier than if he had. The truck hooked the Escalade, metal clanking, but Christopher's eyes stayed on Olivia until she blended into the afternoon, leaving him unsettled, the city suddenly louder around him. If you're hooked in and you're enjoying this story, click like and subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Monday morning came with the kind of quiet that felt like a warning. Olivia stood in the lobby of a downtown Houston high-rise, the smell of polished stone and fresh coffee hanging in the air. She'd been pulled off her usual route and told, politely, carefully, to report upstairs. No explanation, just a badge swipe and a pointed finger toward the elevators. Her mind filled the silence with familiar fears. Layoffs. A complaint. Maybe someone didn't like how she'd done a job. Maybe she was about to be told thank you and goodbye in the same breath. The elevator rose too smoothly. The boardroom was glass and steel, long table gleaming under recessed lights. Executives filtered in with tablets and murmured greetings. Olivia took a seat near the end, hands folded, eyes steady. She'd learned how to be small in rooms like this without disappearing. The door opened again. Christopher Baker walked in, jacket draped over one arm, expression composed and distant, until his eyes lifted. They locked. For a fraction of a second, the room seemed to tilt. The bus stop, the heat, the open hood, the water bottle. Recognition hit them both, sharp and undeniable. Christopher's step faltered. Olivia's breath caught, then settled. She didn't look away. Silence stretched. Someone cleared a throat. A chair scraped softly. Christopher took his seat at the head of the table, the position unchanged, the authority intact. But something else had shifted. The numbers on the agenda felt suddenly less certain, the room less sealed. Olivia sat with the weight of being seen without permission, without preparation. He glanced at her again, quick, searching, then faced forward. "Let's begin," he said. The meeting started like any other. Slides clicked. Forecasts rolled by. Words like efficiency and optimization floated through the air. Olivia listened, her pulse steady, her presence a quiet counterpoint. The power in the room hadn't moved on paper, but emotionally it leaned, unsettled, toward a truth neither of them had planned to confront. As the agenda advanced, the unresolved moment between them lingered, charged and patient, waiting for the part where someone would have to decide what mattered more, the roles they brought with them or the humanity they'd stumbled into on a Houston street. The meeting tried to move forward. Christopher let the slides advance, nodded at projections, asked the right questions in the right order. From the outside, he looked steady, CEO composed, hands folded, voice even. Inside, the image of a Houston street kept intruding. Heat wavering off asphalt, an open hood ticking, a woman offering water without asking who he was. Olivia sat near the end of the table, quiet among tailored jackets and glowing screens. She kept her eyes on the agenda, listening as numbers stacked neatly on the wall. Percentages, savings, operational efficiencies. When the line item appeared, janitorial division, cost reduction, the room leaned in, pens ready. Christopher's throat tightened. "Let's pause," he said. The clicker went silent. Heads turned. "This wasn't on the schedule. I want to tell you about something that happened to me this weekend," he continued, choosing his words carefully. "I was stranded. No signal, no plan, and someone I didn't deserve help from stepped in anyway." A few executives exchanged looks. Christopher went on, describing the heat, the delay, the quiet generosity of a stranger who offered water and shade after being inconvenienced. He didn't mention the splash. "Not yet. I realized," he said, "how easy it is to turn people into numbers. How quickly we forget the hands that keep things running when we're not looking." He paused. The room held. If this story was going to matter, it needed witnesses, people willing to stay present long enough to let it change them. Stories like this don't survive on their own. They survive because someone chooses not to look away. Christopher's gaze found Olivia. "This is Olivia Noah," he said. The shift was immediate. Chairs adjusted. Screens felt suddenly too bright. Olivia met his eyes, calm and unflinching. The truth landed without drama, heavier for it. "She helped me when I needed it," Christopher added. "And she works here." Silence filled the space, different from before, charged, clarifying. The old rules, the ones that kept decisions tidy and distant, felt thin. Insufficient. Christopher turned back to the agenda. "We're not cutting this division today," he said. "We're re-examining how we value it." No applause. No relief yet. Just a room recalibrating, aware that something essential had been named, and that going back to business as usual would no longer be simple. The change didn't arrive with applause or a press release. It came quietly, line by line. Agendas were reopened. Slides were revised. Words like reduction and streamlining were replaced with questions about coverage gaps, about turnover, about what it actually cost when buildings stopped being cared for. Departments once marked for cuts were given breathing room. Someone asked for the first time what a living wage looked like in Houston. Another asked how night crews were scheduled and why overtime always landed on the same shoulders. Olivia watched from the edge of the room, careful not to mistake motion for victory. She'd seen plans change before, on paper. She didn't smile. She didn't relax. She kept her hands folded and her face neutral, listening for what wasn't being said yet. When the meeting finally adjourned, people filed out in clusters, voices low. Christopher lingered. He waited until the room cleared, then crossed the space toward her with an uncertainty that hadn't been there before. "I owe you an apology," he said. The words came out stiff, practiced, then softened. "For the street. For the call. For not seeing what was right in front of me." Olivia looked at him, measuring. She didn't rush to make it easier. "I'm not here for apologies," she said evenly. "I'm here to do my job. Same as before." Christopher nodded, absorbing the correction. "I know. He stopped himself, exhaled. "I'm trying to learn how to do mine better." She considered that. "Learning's fine," she said, "but it's what happens after that matters." They stood there a moment, the distance between them smaller than it had been on Westheimer Road, still real. Not erased by good intentions. Not bridged by one meeting. Outside the glass walls, the city moved on. Lunch crowds, traffic, the ordinary churn of a Monday that didn't know it had been nudged. Olivia picked up her bag. "I've got a floor to finish," she said. Christopher stepped aside. "Thank you," he offered, careful this time. She met his eyes. "Do the work," she replied. As she walked out, Christopher stayed where he was, aware that power hadn't vanished. It had shifted shape, and that rewriting it would take more than a moment of clarity. If you're hooked in and you're enjoying this story, click like and subscribe button, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. The news didn't travel with announcements or emails marked all staff. It moved the way real change usually does, sideways. A supervisor stopped rushing past and said good morning by name. A schedule posted a week earlier than usual. Supplies arrived on time. Small things, but they stacked. In break rooms and supply closets, janitors noticed. Not celebration, recognition. Eye contact where there hadn't been any. A sense that the floor beneath them might hold. Olivia felt it in the rhythm of her days. The work was the same. Mops, keys, the quiet of after hours, but the edges softened. She wasn't pulled last minute to cover gaps that never closed. Overtime was offered, not assumed. She still clocked in early, still cleaned like someone would be there notice if she didn't, but the knot in her shoulders loosened a fraction. At home, the fridge stayed full through the week. The bus pass on the counter didn't feel as fragile. She slept a little deeper, waking to the sound of the city instead of worry. Across the country, Christopher Baker stood in the wide windows of Marlin Mansion, Washington, D.C., watching the Potomac catch the light. The house had always been a place of decisions, quiet, controlled, distant. He took meetings in rooms that smelled of old wood and certainty, but his mind kept drifting back to Houston, to heat shimmering off asphalt, to an open hood and a woman who'd offered help without asking for anything in return. He changed how meetings started, asked different questions, paused longer before saying yes to cuts that looked clean on a spreadsheet. When someone spoke about efficiency, he asked about impact. When silence fell, he waited. The Texas heat traveled with him. Not as discomfort, but as memory, a reminder that power was only useful if it stayed connected to the ground, that the work people didn't see was often the work that held everything up. Back in Houston, Olivia finished a floor and turned off the lights, the room settling into quiet. She paused at the doorway, listening to the building breathe. The changes were subtle, unfinished. but they were real enough to feel, and that was something worth carrying forward. The weeks that followed didn't announce themselves. They settled. Olivia learned to recognize the difference between panic and possibility. Panic rushed, demanded, stole sleep. Possibility moved slower. It waited for proof. On quiet evenings, she cleaned offices the way she always had, methodical, careful, but the work felt chosen now. Not because it had become easier, but because fear had loosened its grip. She could say no to an extra shift without worrying what it might cost her. She could plan a weekend without bracing for the next emergency. Little moments revealed the shift. A supervisor asked before changing a route. A paycheck that matched the hours worked. A thank you that didn't feel performative. None of it fixed everything. It didn't need to. It showed direction. She thought about how the smallest decisions had started it. The choice to walk toward a stalled car instead of away, to speak plainly instead of shrinking. How easily those moments could have been missed. How often they were. In Washington, D.C., Christopher watched his empire from a distance that felt newly honest. Numbers still mattered. They always would. But he learned to see them as shadows cast by real people moving through real days. He adjusted timelines. Asked who would carry the load when something was cut. When a proposal promised savings, he asked where the cost would land. He wasn't redeemed. He didn't pretend to be. He was altered, alert to the way power echoed long after a meeting ended. Sometimes he thought about the bus stop on Westheimer Road and felt the heat rise again, a reminder not to get comfortable. The story slowed. It breathed. One evening, Olivia finished her route early and stepped outside as dusk softened the sky. The city hummed, familiar and forgiving. She didn't feel triumphant. She felt steady. That was enough. Neither of them had been rescued. No one had crossed a finish line. But something durable had shifted, a way of seeing, a way of choosing. And in the quiet after the storm, that felt like real change. Weeks later, Olivia stood at the same bus stop on Westheimer Road. The road hadn't changed. The heat still pressed down, heavy and familiar. Traffic rushed past in impatient waves. A puddle lingered near the curb, drying slowly, leaving a faint outline that only meant something if you knew where to look. She knew. Olivia adjusted the strap of her bag and waited, feeling the difference in her body before she named it. The weight was still there, work, bills, the quiet responsibility of showing up, but it no longer sat in her chest like a warning. It rested where resolve lives. She hadn't forgotten what could be taken. She just wasn't bracing for it every second. Across the country, Christopher paused in a corridor at Marlin Mansion, Washington, D.C., sunlight cutting across framed plans and polished floors. He'd ended a call early, the decision still warm in his hand. As he stood there, Houston returned to him without asking. The stalled engine, the borrowed shade, the woman who had offered help without needing credit. Power hadn't left him. It never does. But it no longer felt weightless. He'd learned that moments like that survive only if someone keeps them alive, by choosing differently the next time and the time after that. By remembering that distance can be closed, but only on purpose. At the bus stop, Olivia watched a city bus pull into view. She thought about how easily that afternoon could have passed without notice. How often kindness disappears because no one stays long enough to see it through. If stories like hers are going to matter, it's because someone decides they do, because someone carries them forward, not loudly, not performatively, but steadily. Staying connected, she'd learned, is its own kind of work. The bus doors opened. Olivia stepped on, nodded to the driver, and took a seat by the window. As it pulled away, the street folded back into itself, ordinary again. No victory pose, no final word, just awareness, moving quietly through the world, doing what it could to last. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe and share it with your friends. Your support brings us closer to our 1K subscriber milestone and inspires us to keep creating more emotional stories of resilience, healing, and Black excellence. Thank you for being part of our journey. Your presence matters more than you know.